Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming for this great opportunity to, first of all, to hear Leontyne Price's voice. I'm Sue Vita, the chief of the music division here at the Library of Congress, and I'm happy to welcome all of you to tonight's presentation, Integration Without Identification, NBC TV, Leontyne Price, and Opera Casting in the Civil Rights Era, which is the next installment in a lecture series that the music division has been happily co-sponsoring with the American Musicological Society for 15 years. We began the series 15 years ago with the intention of highlighting meaningful scholarship that the American Musicological Society members have produced as a result of research in the library's unique music collections. Over the past decade, we have been fortunate to learn about a variety of topics from Schoenberg to Showboat. Tonight, we turn to Leontyne Price and NBC Opera casting choices of the 1950s. It's interesting, just a little side note, that just today, the Price family is fairly local, and we let them know that we were having this lecture in the hopes that they would be happy to know about it first, and then also perhaps to come. They're elderly, as you are aware, and so they won't be joining us, but they were kind enough to email Ray White today and express how happy they are that this lecture is being put on and the research was being done. And they expressed a desire to get the link when this is a little advert for you. When it goes online, it will be sure to check it out and see it twice. So as always, we're recording tonight's lecture so that it will be available to watch in coming months, both on library's website and YouTube channels. So past lectures are already online, and so I would suggest that you check those out. I don't know if all of you have paid attention to the display that we have over on the east side of the room. But if you haven't had a chance, I hope you'll take a look after the lecture. It's fun to see these photographs and letters and memorabilia from that era. And now I'd like to introduce Dr. Paul Allen Sommerfeld, Senior Music Reference Specialist and AMS Council Member, who will introduce tonight's speaker. Take this.
Thank you, Sue. It is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight, Dr. Danielle Ward-Griffin, who is an assistant professor of musicology at Rice University. Her research examines the performance and mediatization of 20th century opera in the United States, United Kingdom, and Canada. She was recently awarded an NEH Fellowship for her book, Televising Opera, Broadcasting and Performance in Anglo-American Culture, 1945 to 1975, which is under contract with Oxford University Press. She has been the winner of several awards, including the Deems Taylor Virgil Thompson Award from ASCAP, the Westrup Prize from the journal Music and Letters, and the Ruth Soley Award from the North American British Music Studies Association, as well as several fellowships, including the Virgil Thompson Fellowship from the Society for American Music and the Temperley Prize, also from the North American British Music Studies Association. Her lecture tonight examines television and its influence on opera casting practices during the early civil rights movement, tracing how NBC's colorblind integration without identification policy was praised for eliminating stereotypes and hiring Black performers in its prestige arts programs. Focusing on the NBC Opera appearances of Leontyne Price, especially her debut in Tosca, Ward-Griffin's research explores how television promised new opportunities for Black singers at a time when they were still barred from many roles in the opera house. Drawing upon the NBC History Files and kinescopes from the Library of Congress, as well as NBC papers from the Wisconsin Historical Society, Ward-Griffin argues that television, particularly its aesthetic of realism, influenced the perception of Price's performances, and by extension, ideas of who could credibly perform standard opera roles. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Ward-Griffin.
Thank you all so very much for coming to this talk. I'd like to thank the American Musicological Society and the Library of Congress for inviting me to give this talk. And I am especially grateful to Paul Sommerfeld, Josie Walters-Johnston, Laura Jenneman, and Aaron Prescott for helping me to secure materials, including the film that we'll be able to see tonight. I'd also like to thank the staff at the Wisconsin Historical Society who provided me with written materials from their NBC papers in the middle of the pandemic, as well as NBC for providing permissions for the video screening today. A content warning before we begin. This talk relies on historical documents which use terminology that is outdated and may reflect racist and sexist attitudes of the time. Whenever I am quoting from these documents, that language will be displayed on the screen, and otherwise I will use today's terminology. In 1961, shortly after her debut at the Metropolitan Opera, soprano Leontyne Price reflected, "My name, whatever it is, was made by the TV Tosca in 1955. Today, we may best remember the acclaimed singer for starring in the stage performances of Aida or Antony and Cleopatra. So it's easy to forget that she first came to national attention in the title role of a production of Tosca produced by NBC television. Even those who know this history often haven't seen the actual broadcast, which is not available outside of archives. Nor may they know the fascinating story of how Price came to be cast in the role during a time when Black singers were often barred from main roles in the standard repertoire. Tonight, we're lucky to get to watch clips from this broadcast, housed here at the Library of Congress, and see parts of the performance that made Price a household name. But even more than that, we'll explore what this production meant, not just to Price's career, but to opera casting, the history of broadcasting, and the push for civil rights more broadly. My talk today is in 4 parts. We'll start by looking at the history of opera casting in the 1950s. This history has typically focused on the Met, but I'll show how the TV Tosca was an even more important force in challenging ideas about suitable roles for Black singers in the mid-1950s. Next, we'll examine NBC's colorblind hiring policy, integration without identification, and how it responded to the civil rights push for greater and fairer media representation. Using internal memos from the NBC collection in Wisconsin, we'll see what this policy promised Black performers, as well as what it actually delivered in practice. Third, I'll show how Price's performance was not just an extension of the integration without identification policy, as commonly thought, but was influenced by the NBC Opera's aesthetic as they tried to reimagine what opera casting and performance could look like. And finally, we'll examine the reception of Tosca, especially how it made viewers rethink what would be suitable or realistic in opera. The story of Tosca, then, is not just the story of a single opera performance, but of the ways in which new technology and the struggle for civil rights intersected in the 1950s. And it may have some lessons for us in our current moment as the opera industry tries to broaden its audience through digital media while reforming systemic inequities for performers of color. A recurring theme throughout my talk today will be that of realism, that is, how opera may reflect reality. At first, realism may not seem to connect to opera, which with its grandeur, over-the-top plots, melodramatic acting, and extravagant costumes, may seem like an alternative universe, far removed from everyday life. And yet ideas about what would be realistic have often governed who appears in which roles. Although opera has long accepted singers who are older or larger than the characters they depict, race has been treated differently and has often been used to restrict singers of color on stage. We can see this in comments of Rudolph Bing, the general manager of the Metropolitan Opera, who is often lauded for featuring Marian Anderson as the first Black singer first Black woman on the Met stage. Only a few weeks before Anderson's debut, Rudolph Bing published an article in the New York Times in which he stated that he was willing to audition Black singers, but he needed to listen to them with a certain repertory in mind, and he has to consider the parts in which they were cast. He also replied to a letter writer who opposed hiring Black singers that he disagreed with him in principle, but noted that, "I don't think that I will have any Negro singers in next season's roster, as there are no suitable parts." This idea of suitability was not unique to Bing. It comes up again in a Time magazine article the same year, which noted that at most a dozen roles in the standard repertory are usually considered suitable for female Negro singers. Despite the fact that the New York City Opera featured Camilla Williams and Todd Duncan in integrated productions as early as the mid-1940s, these ideas of suitability remained in force at many national opera houses. So what does suitable mean? Scholars such as Nina Sund-Einsheim have shown us how this idea of suitability often had little to do with actual vocal talent, but much more to do with projecting ideas about Blackness onto the sound or singer. This could take the form of suggesting Black singers are best suited to singing spirituals, regardless of the singer's own preference, or the practice of only casting Black singers in roles that are marked as other in the opera repertoire. For example, when Marian Anderson and Robert McFerrin finally broke the color barrier at the Met in 1955, they appeared in roles that stand apart as exotic or different. Anderson sang the role of a fortune teller in Verdi's A Masked Ball, and McFerrin played the solitary Ethiopian king in Verdi's Aida. So even while these singers integrated the stage, they didn't necessarily break the casting barrier, that is, the reified ways of thinking about realism and race in opera. Claims of suitability also often restricted Black performers from appearing as romantic interests for white singers in the United States, particularly in states where interracial marriage remained illegal. Given how much of opera concerns love stories, this meant that Black singers were in effect barred from performing many roles in mixed-race productions. And even roles that have typically served as an entry point into the art form, like the Ethiopian princess of Aida, have tended to pigeonhole singers, and some singers have refused to sing them for this very reason. We can see how these ideas of suitability and realism shaped the beginning of Price's career, even as she would soon surpass them. After being spotted as a student at Juilliard, she appeared in a revival of Virgil Thomson's opera Four Saints in Three Acts, which required an all-Black cast. She then played Bess in Broadway producer Robert Breen's musical version of Gershwin's Porgy and Bess. But a number of reviewers criticized the work for indulging in stereotypes, as well as being one of the few roles that were open to Black singers. There is no sound in New York to surpass the full, beautiful voice of talented Leontyne Price's Bess. But this in itself is America's disgrace. For here are voices second to none in this nation. But because these voices stem from the bosom of Black breasts, they are not being heard from the stage of the Metropolitan Opera where they belong. Of course, many of us remember Price for her acclaimed role as Aida, first sung at the Vienna Staatsoper in 1958. After she sung the role at La Scala in 1960, one Italian critic raved, "At last, we have heard the true Aida, as Verdi probably imagined her." Much like previous reception of Black singers in the role, such comments tended to naturalize her performance by virtue of her race, but Price found a way to make the role her own. As she put it, "Aida says things about where I am as a woman and as a human being, about my life and the progress, or lack thereof, of millions of people at home in the States, things I could not have said as eloquently in other ways. But while Aida is undoubtedly important in how we remember Price's legacy, we also have to remember that back in 1955, she had not yet appeared in any main stage opera production with a national audience. Instead, it was the new medium of television that first offered her the opportunity. And here's how Price recalled it in a 1987 Kennedy Center interview.
This, shall we say, progressive move of NBC and Samuel Shotsonoff, who at that time was running the NBC theater, decided that they wanted to take a chance. It was a barrier-breaking time for me, which seems later on to have been the story of my life, and happily. I love that responsibility. It still keeps me on my tippies. I like that I like challenges. If that had to be one, then fine. But it was the first time that a black artist had been in a major operatic role on national television. So there was a lot of rumpus and rumbling about it.
I would add that this production was also the first time that a black singer had performed opposite a white romantic lead in a national opera production, on or off stage, on and off screen in the United States. So even though it came just weeks after Anderson's debut at the Met, Price's performance was markedly different, as it challenged beliefs about suitable roles for black singers and what could be realistic in opera. So given this history, you would have thought that NBC would have heralded Leontyne Price's casting as Tosca in its press releases. Here's one press release from the NBC History Collection at the Library of Congress, which announces that Price had been chosen to play the title role, but it never mentions how historic the casting of a black singer was in this production. Another press release simply notes that Price is one of two newcomers, alongside Josh Wheeler as Scarpia. The only possible reference to Price's race was the fact that she had performed in Porgy and Bess, and perhaps in a slight to the musicalized version of the production, the suggestion that Tosca would be Price's first major operatic assignment. To be clear, I am not saying that Price's race needed to be foregrounded or that the historic nature of this casting had to be highlighted. But I have done a lot of work on the NBC Opera, and this was a company who loved to advertise historic firsts, especially when they came off looking better than the Met, who they saw as their rival. In fact, if we look at the other press releases for Tosca, we see that it was advertised as the first time a new English translation would be heard, the first continuous 2-hour presentation by the opera company on television, and it's not shown here, but also the first time that an opera score would be uncut in an NBC Opera broadcast. In other words, every possible first you could think of, but the casting of a black singer in a title role was completely new and yet completely unmentioned. So when I dug further into the NBC archives in the Wisconsin Historical Society, I discovered that this silence wasn't an accident. Instead, it was part of a wider NBC policy known as integration without identification. This was a colorblind hiring policy developed in the early 1950s by publicity representative Joseph V. Baker. And it can be defined as employment on the basis of ability without regard to race or color. It was inspired by anti-discrimination orders in the wake of World War II, especially the Presidential Commission of Civil Rights, whose report to secure these rights prevented discrimination based on race, color, religion, or social position. As we can see, NBC's parent company, RCA, used similar wording, substituting creed for religion and national origin for social position, but keeping the overall intent the same. This policy also drew on discourses of colorblindness in the 50s and 60s that put the emphasis on ability. And here you can see the NBC's executives claim that the only yardstick in hiring performers was ability, without regard for racial derivation. Similar to other colorblind initiatives, scholars have noted that this approach tended to put the focus on the individual, presuming that the problem was recognition of race or identification, rather than more systemic inequities. But it was not enough to simply offer more opportunity to Black performers in broadcasting. The roles that Black performers were assigned to play were key. And this is where a second part, the Continuity Acceptance Radio Television Department, I'm going to call it CART, comes in. As TV emerged, NBC tried to eliminate some of the racist stereotypes in pre-existing radio shows, plays, and films that might be made into TV programs. The leader of this department, Stockton Helfrich, noted that while they looked at all stereotypes, the anti-Black stereotypes are the worst of all. They certainly weren't funny 25 years ago, and they are completely unspeakable in 1953. To this end, CART employees, known as blue pencil specialists, eliminated objectionable lyrics from Stephen Foster songs and worked to phase out blackface performance. They also featured performers in non-stereotyped roles. So for instance, Natalie Hinderis, a classical pianist, was featured on TV and radio in 1953, and actor Sidney Poitier appeared in a Philco Playhouse production, which NBC promoted as a situation where he, like the rest of the cast, was strictly an individual concerned with the problems that might confront any parole officer. In doing this work, NBC was responding to pressure from civil rights organizations, who made the case that it was not only the right thing to do, but that it made good business sense. Here, for instance, is a statement of the Coordinating Council of Negro Performers, or CCMP, founded in 1951 and chaired by Lester A. Walton. It noted that Black Americans spend $15 billion yearly, and that they should work to convince sponsors to make a more liberal and broader integration of Negro performers in television and radio programs. As we can see in NBC's internal memos, this message really resonated with the network. Although the number changes a bit, the network was really keen to tap into a larger audience and their potential spending power. The policy also made good business sense in another way, as it allowed NBC to distinguish themselves from other networks, especially CBS, which was televising the minstrel show Amos and Andy and was the subject of boycotts by the NAACP. We can compare this with NBC, which received awards, including an Urban League Cup for its policy and a citation from a sorority for a production with a non-stereotyped role. The question remains, though, as to how much things really changed. In 1953, Joe Baker prepared a confidential report in which he noted that there were only 50 employees at NBC. That's only a bit more than the 35 there were in 1950 before they adopted the policy, and a drop in the bucket in a workforce of about 2,000 employees. Part of the problem was that the central office of NBC required employees to have experience, but local stations, which were independently owned and operated, often refused to hire Black employees. As an article in the Chicago World described it, it's that vicious old circle. One can't qualify because of inexperience, which exists because there's no opportunity for gaining required experience. When it came to putting performers on the national network, NBC seemed to do better, with the emphasis on seemed. In a meeting with members of the Black press, one executive trumpeted an increase of 200% in the use of Black artists in 1952, for a total of some 2,453 appearances on radio or television. But if we look a little closer at these numbers, we'll see some very creative math. In the first 5 months of 1952, there had been 270 appearances of Black artists on the radio, but that 270 appearances consisted of only 5 musical acts, heard more than once. So those 270 appearances were just counting each individual Black musician in the group. And I promise this is the only math in this presentation. Even NBC acknowledged internally that much of the increase was not due to their policy, but to the popularity of radio broadcasts from nightclubs with large, predominantly Black orchestras. Television was a bit better, but again, its 287 appearances translated to just 23 musical acts, an increase of only 4% over the previous year. As a result, the Coordinating Council of Negro Performers concluded that in 1952, only 1 Black artist was employed for every 200 white performers on TV. The other issue was that although music and drama departments at NBC were encouraged to consider Black performers for their roles, they were often not given the resources to do so. To compensate, in 1953, CCMP provided the network with a list of names of available performers. And in response, NBC noted, if we do not make use of some of these people, we will not have further excuses. This can get to be a very serious problem unless we move forward in a constructive way. By the mid-1950s then, NBC was increasingly under fire that their policies had failed to yield real progress. One journalist decried the network's incremental approach, saying, "There are worse stereotypes than those they exclaimed have been deleted. There are those of status quo thinking." To make matters worse, Joseph Baker left the company, and NBC started to slip behind CBS, which had dropped Amos and Andy and signed Nat King Cole. NBC needed to do something big and quick. Enter stage left, Price at the NBC Opera. Between 1949 and 1964, NBC had its own opera company, which put on 4 to 6 TV broadcasts a year, and it even had a live touring group in the mid-1950s. It was also a sustaining program, which meant that it was supported by the network and not beholden to advertisers. The decision to feature Leontyne Price in the NBC Opera has typically been understood as a simple extension of the integration without identification policy. But I would argue that it was actually a way to make amends for the failed potential of the program thus far. In fact, the opera program had been at the center of a casting controversy too. On Christmas Eve, 1951, NBC premiered its most famous TV opera, Giancarlo Menotti's Amal and the Night Visitors, which tells the story of a poor boy and his mother who are visited by 3 kings on their way to baby Jesus. In the broadcast, white singer Leon Lischner performed the role of the Moor king in blackface, to which many viewers objected. In response, NBC said that Menotti had just provided the score at the last minute, but that if we repeat the opera next Christmas, they were going to sing out a Black singer for the role. And yet, NBC recast Lischner in the role the following year, and they were due to cast him again in 1953. And you have to remember, this is a time when TV, of course, is live, so it's not as though they're just kind of pressing play on a pre-recorded show. And they often had to recast the boy as well because the boys' voices would break. So they are having to do casting. So this controversy led baseball player Jackie Robinson, who was working in a community relations role for NBC, to threaten to quit if the casting was not changed for 1953. For their part, NBC tried to deflect criticism by integrating the troupe, mostly by trying to feature Mary Hinkson, a Black dancer. In the end, Robinson made good on his threat, deciding that he was convinced there was no future for me in the company. And this is not directly related to opera, but he also says that he would have left baseball for NBC, which I just find astounding. Amal was only the tip of the iceberg at NBC Opera. As we can see in this undated list from the NBC History Files, NBC Opera did not feature many Black performers in the early 1950s, and most of these performers were dancers. You may also notice that in keeping with ideas about suitability, the number of performers increases for so-called exotic operas, such as Salome and The Abduction of Seraglio. At one point, NBC had wanted to produce an American opera with a Black lead, The Emperor Jones by Louis Grunberg, focusing on a tyrannical ruler following the Haitian Revolution. But the idea was squashed by upper administration. Baker warned that by putting it on TV, it could easily reinforce racist stereotypes, leading those already prejudiced to conclude that everything that looks like that acts like that. The problem was that TV was generally seen as a reflection of reality in the 1950s, for good or ill. Because early television was live, making it immediate, and brought its programming directly into the home, making it intimate, it was often thought to be a window on the world. This meant that TV had important responsibilities to accurately reflect reality, a point frequently made by civil rights organizations. For example, the CCMP charged that TV erased the Black presence in America. Only on TV streets, TV banks, TV subways, and theaters are we given the impression that 1/10 of America's population does not exist. This idea that television should reflect reality also shaped TV programs through an aesthetic known as television naturalism, which stressed how television could provide access not just to reality, but to the psychology of the person on screen, with close-ups of their face to showcase their thoughts and emotions. This aesthetic was very important for NBC Opera and influenced their casting. As producer Samuel Chotsanoff explained, because the TV camera brought the story and cast right into the living room, a new type of opera singer, one who looked at once more attractive and authentic, was necessary. And he added the usual ponderous baritone and Percheron-like soprano of the opera house would not be believable on TV. As you can see, Chotsanoff held clear discriminatory biases against larger singers, and not pictured here, but also older singers. Price was young, slim, and conventionally attractive, satisfying Chotsanoff's biases. But she also met Chotsanoff's criterion for authenticity in playing Tosca, a Roman actress, a part traditionally assigned to a white singer on stage. But for Chotsanoff, authenticity hinged not on the race, but on the acting of the singer. In fact, he felt that the opera stage, despite its claims to realism and casting, was completely unrealistic in the kind of acting that it encouraged, calling the Metropolitan little more than concerts in costume. By contrast, Chotsanoff and music director Peter Herman Adler translated operas into English and coached singers to adopt a more small-scale manner of presentation. As Price recalled, this was good training, as one has to do with your eyes and your facial expressions on television, where one can do large gestures on the grand opera stage. We can see this aesthetic in practice in the opening act of Tosca, where the villain Scarpia suggests to Tosca that her lover, Mario Cavaradossi, may have betrayed her with La Davanti, a woman who looks suspiciously like the portrait of the Virgin Mary that Mario is painting. Tosca's increasing agitation is prescribed in performance indications in the libretto, which call for her to be more and more upset and in ever greater grief before singing suddenly with a great resolve. But the camera accentuates and speeds up this process as it captures Price's minute facial expressions in close-up. Following orchestral descent, Price's eyes slightly widen and she looks up with purpose before rushing towards a painting, singing, "You'll never have your lover, I swear it." So let's watch that.
If I knew if I could catch those two together. Oh, the vision, to see I'm right in my dread suspicion. I'm betrayed. Our nest be found by his cheating and lying, but I will not allow it. You'll never have your lover, I swear it.
Blasphemy!
Although Price's acting is calculated to be more small-scale, more intimate for the viewer at home, everything else about this opera stays the same. Tosca, in particular, is known as an opera obsessed with realism, as it offers detailed accounts of real places in Rome. Like other NBC Opera broadcasts, this production stays close to the libretto. The opening credits say that the opera was set in Rome in 1800, and each scene has names of locations accompanied by opulent settings. Scholar Diane Brooks has noted how, in this context, it seems Price was just simply to play Floria Tosca, and no one was supposed to identify her as Black. Indeed, in this respect, the opera was the perfect example of the integration without identification policy. But simply inserting Price into this world could have unintended effects. As Naomi Andre has put it, we do not see race or gender. Brooks, too, has noted how Price's performance, quote, called attention to the text, infusing it with numerous possible and potentially uncomfortable meanings. Take Tosca's jealousy of the sky-blue eyes of the mysterious lady in the painting, who resembles Lattanzi, particularly as Cavaradossi, played by David Polari, reassures her that no other eyes in this world can rival your beautiful dark eyes. Given that these words are uttered in English translation, and NBC Opera really worked on the singer's diction, the statements would draw attention to Price's features, even as the network professed to pay no heed of them. And I'll mention this clip is shortened, so we'll see Price sing of the sky blue eyes, but in the interest of time, I've omitted Cavaradossi's response.
The Holy Virgin, you like it? That's too lovely. You're very flattering. You're laughing. Those sky blue eyes, I know I've seen them somewhere. They are nothing unusual. Where was it? I know her. The Azzahori. Even saw me. Swear it. I swear it. Look, those eyes defy me. Please go now. Stares at me and mocks me. You're raving. Oh, those eyes. I've never seen other eyes as lovely as your ardent dark eyes, my Tosca, eyes that have seized my heart and have engraved there your beauty forever. Eyes no good.
Another example occurs in more intimate scenes between Tosca and Cavaradossi. As we discussed, many Black sopranos were prohibited from performing opposite a white love interest, and Tosca stands out for taking on this taboo in which the Philadelphia Tribune calls a no-holds-barred approach. Minus, there's kind of an awkward side kiss at the end, but that's very much keeping with TV practice at the time. Here is an excerpt from the first duet between the two, sung in English as "Deep in the Woods There is a House."
Deep in the woods there's a house that will hide us. Give us the rest that the world has denied us. No one will find us lonely except death. Love alone will be our guest.
Another scene that takes on additional meanings when performed by Price was Act 2, when Scarpia tries to sexually assault Tosca in exchange for Cavaradossi's freedom. Such scenes in opera have often been mischaracterized as seduction scenes and have been very problematic in depicting sexual assault on stage as we understand it today. If we think of the fact that this TV production was put on in the 1950s, it also takes on another layer of meaning. Scholars such as Danielle McGuire and Darlene Hine have argued that we often overlook how, in the 40s and 50s, Black women's fight against institutionalized sexual violence was at the heart of the struggle for civil rights. Thinking of this performance in that context, the TV broadcast becomes all the more menacing. Scarpia's words, fully understandable in English, are "how you detest me, and that is the way I want you," as he moves closer and closer with shots back and forth between Price and Wheeler, finally providing the most extreme close-up of Wheeler's face, even as Price's singing dominates.
How you detest me,
I do.
and that's the way I want you.
Don't you want? I hate you, hate you, hate you,
Detest me. Passionate and pain, passionate and loving. Listen, hear the drum roll. You hear it? That is a drum announcing an execution.
This pronouncement gives way to the famous aria Visitate sung by Tosca. But unlike the vigorous camera work accompanying Scarpia, the camera draws back from Price, providing space for the aria while also slowing down the rate of shots. Although it is typical for camera shots to be still for suspended aria time, they usually offer a close-up. Here, the camera provides a wider perspective and side shots, blocking Scarpia from view, so that the effect of the camera is to offer Tosca privacy, even as it supposedly reveals the character's innermost thoughts, per the aesthetic of TV naturalism. And this is a bit of a longer clip because I wanted us to hear this wonderful performance. Very much so. Later in the same scene, after Tosca has been forced to accept Scarpia's terms, the camera zooms into Price looking defeated and almost in shell shock before she lights on a knife, arches her eyebrows, and stabs Scarpia. While much of this action is fairly common in Tosca's production, the scene in which Tosca seizes her own fate had broader repercussions when enacted by a black soprano in the United States against her white attacker, and once again we'll see it in close-up.
Which way will you travel?
The shortest,
You mean by water?
yes. shoot you. Tired and
In taking revenge and asserting her agency in the scene, Price's performance speaks to two overlapping worlds, the scene of the opera and the reality offstage. Scholar Naomi Andre has made a similar point about watching Price perform the role of Aida. It feels like a moment when the drama on stage and the reality off stage crash together, and I feel as if I understand something new each and every time I experience it. The 1955 NBC Tosca similarly brings out these moments of tension. If, as widely believed, television was to serve as a window to the world, then the NBC Tosca could not help but bring contemporary reality into the opera. For many viewers, it was the very realism of the opera that made the NBC Tosca so powerful and dangerous. In fact, the broadcast was thought to be so dangerous that a number of Southern affiliate stations refused to carry it. Although lore has it that it was not seen south of the Dixie Line, these undated station lists, which I believe are also over there on the table, suggest that it was at least supposed to be broadcast in some Southern cities, although Price said it was not shown in her hometown of Laurel, Mississippi. But even where it was shown, it was not universally accepted. According to NBC records, Chicago received 26 calls in protest, Washington received 23 calls in protest, and the West Coast got 100 phone calls. They don't separate them out for positive and negative, but especially at the beginning, where Tosca cuddles up with Cavaradossi. The memo here notes how one woman, Virginia Rapp, called in protest to the lovemaking and pawing, and she promised to follow up with a letter, and she did, and we have it. So as we can see, this statement here that there is no dramatic excuse for this casting, as there would be in Aida, and that it goes against kind of casting practices to have interracial romances. All of this recycles common prejudices about race, realism, and opera casting. But it also makes the case that other letter writers made that because interracial marriage was not legal in some states, the casting was not realistic. A strange argument, given that this production of Tosca was set neither in the 1950s nor in the USA. But perhaps the more important point was that viewers expected television to mirror their desired reality, and they protested when it didn't. The same focus on reality, however, was also what won this production such praise. Although the NBC received negative phone calls at the outset of the program, they were outweighed by the positive phone calls and letters that flooded in afterwards. So most people called when they had a negative thing to say at the beginning and then turned the program off, presumably. In fact, one viewer noted that after the initial shock wore off, I was completely happy with your choice. She was in all respects very fine, and NBC as a company can certainly pat itself on the back for this forward-looking step. In the press, Opera News called it a Tosca for tomorrow. Pittsburgh Courier noted that Price had looks, experience, and ability, which seems like almost a direct paraphrase of integration without identification criteria, while the New York Post called it potent theatrical magic, more dramatically compelling than is usually afforded in the opera house itself. The NAACP was particularly attuned to the possible ramifications, writing, "This seems to me an even more significant step than the opening of the Metropolitan Opera House, in that television projects its programs into the individual homes throughout the country." And for her part, Price recalled it in this way.
That it was such an astounding experience. Then after that, nobody gave one single hoot. That is, I think, what they say pioneering. Groundbreaking is. You know, it's like everything else. You get on with it once it's done and build from it.
And building upon it is just what the NBC tried to do. Following Tosca, an NBC executive recommended an NBC Opera with a Negro star or co-star, which would help to put to rest the feeling that Tosca was a one-shot accident. But despite Price's success, the company did not witness a great increase in the number of Black singers, even though Matilda Dobbs was floated as a possible queen of the night in The Magic Flute. Although you'll notice that the press executive falls back into the kind of racist ideas of suitability about how a Black singer shouldn't be cast in a romantic role, saying in this opera, the queen merely appears several times and does not get into personal contact with the other performers. Nor did Tosca lead to a change in repertoire. NBC Opera considered a work by Black composer Clarence Cameron White, as recommended by Walton at the CCMP, but it never came to fruition for reasons that remain unclear. Rather, like the integration without identification policy, the NBC production of Tosca seems to have benefited one individual, Price herself. She went on to star in 3 more productions, The Magic Flute in '56, Dialogues of the Carmelite in 1957, and Don Giovanni in 1961, before the NBC Opera folded in 1964. At the same time, the integration without identification policy was gradually abandoned, with Price's Tosca representing its pinnacle success. Ironically, this singularity was emblematic of how the policy actually worked in practice, elevating one star above all others. What then can we learn from the NBC Tosca today, especially as opera companies try to broaden their audience via new media and reform their casting practices? Well, for one thing, I think the case of Tosca shows us how realism is a bit of a moving target, having as much to do with us as what is written in the libretto or the score. In Tosca, TV brought certain expectations of realism that Price's acting fulfilled, leading the press to acclaim her believable portrayal of the role. Time magazine said she became Floria Tosca, Musical America called it eminently convincing, and the New York Times praised it as the most dramatic and convincing performance that the reviewer had seen. Moreover, as we've seen, viewers judged the realism of the production by how well it aligned with their own ideas about American reality. It thus shows how debates about operatic realism are not abstract, but rather can serve as a proxy for debates about how reality on and off stage ought to be. As opera companies today invest in new stories about American life, the NBC Tosca demonstrates how realism is and has always been actively constructed by performers, directors, and opera fans in order to make sense of the contemporary world in which they live. The NBC Tosca also offers a case of how technological media have played a role in shaping opera casting practices. Although the effects of Price's casting may have been limited on NBC TV, television had an important influence on opera performance, as the NAACP predicted. Only 1 year after Price's appearance as Tosca, the Met cast Matilda Dobbs in Rigoletto opposite a white romantic lead. In addition, Price herself would often reprise roles that she had originated on screen. So, for example, her portrayal of Pamina in the NBC's The Magic Flute in 1956 anticipated her depiction of this same character at the Vienna Staatsoper in '58. Many discussions of opera casting today suggest that the problem is bringing opera casting in line with norms of 21st century media. But the case of the NBC Tosca shows how opera in new media has sometimes led the way, so that opera and technology are not as oppositional as often thought. As opera companies invest in digital media and live streams, we can think of these televisual norms not as simply imposed upon opera, but rather part of its historical development, as what we see on screen helps to shape what we see on stage. And finally, the NBC Tosca shows how opera casting practices have never been static, but have always responded to times of social change. The case of Tosca, then, shows how the past does not need to dictate present practices, as it offers an early example of how opera companies bucked standard casting practices, forcing the public to re-examine their assumptions. At the same time, it poses a cautionary tale, revealing how new approaches can end up reinforcing the status quo and limiting opportunity, even as or because such forward-looking stances are lauded. It thus shows both the potential and limitations of approaches at a time when many opera houses are rethinking their practices. After the broadcast of Tosca, the Pittsburgh Courier sent a wire. "It looks as though we are moving. Tosca is the best yet for your company." In response, NBC wrote back, "We are moving, and we have always been on the move at NBC." Although some of this movement may have stalled, the complicated story of Tosca can help inform the opera industry as it moves forward in trying to create greater opportunities for singers while reaching a new audience through technology. By attending to these dimensions of opera performance, both off and on stage, we may be able to envision a new operatic reality, one for the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much for an absolutely wonderful talk, Danielle. We have a little time for questions.
There's two quick things. I imagine we're the only people in the room that have two working 1950s televisions in our home. So what we saw tonight is brilliant, but it's about 4 times bigger on the screen, and you would add a 5-inch single speaker. The sound is better. This is wonderful that it's preserved in such a pristine format. 13 years later, NBC aired an episode that's generally cited as the first interracial kiss, 1968 Star Trek's William Shatner and Nichelle Nichols. In all these operas with a black female, or I don't know if there's a black male and a white lead, romantic lead, was there, I mean, that's an awfully close side kiss that you could cite as actually 13 years earlier than Star Trek. Nothing that showed a romantic kiss in all of those operas in an interracial couple?
You mean before this one? Not before this one, because the only black singers would have been in the chorus.
Anytime before 68.
68. You know, this is a great thing. So I need to go rewatch Magic Flute because she stars as Pamina, right? And so that's definitely possibility there.
A significant TV trivia question.
Yeah. I know. Oh, thank you so much. Thank you for that.
Thank you. Sorry. First of all, thank you so much. This was tremendous and beautifully presented. Very quick research suggestion and a very quick question. The research suggestion, I noticed you did some excellent research with African American newspapers. I would suggest that if you're trying to find out in which southern cities they actually broadcast the opera, African American newspapers from the days or the week after the opera might be a good source to find out where it was shown in the South. The quick question, and I apologize for asking something so pedestrian after a talk that has so much depth, but how did the NBC archives end up in the Wisconsin Historical Society? It seems so unlikely.
I'm going to defer to the Wisconsin Historical Society, but they have huge broadcasting archives. So it's not just NBC, it's also National Educational Television with PBS. So they are actually a huge font of research. I will add one article that I've seen, which is really fascinating. It's from February 1955, and it's by Walter White, and he's suggesting that Price's hometown of Laurel, Mississippi, went to the expense of piping in the transmission from New Orleans. However, New Orleans is not on that undated station list. So I don't know if they're if he's mixing it up and it was actually piped in from Jackson, Mississippi. But this is one of those things that I'm really eager to unravel, because I noticed that there's this constant idea that it wasn't broadcast south of the Dixie Line, and people never really cite anybody. They're kind of like citing in a circle, in a sense. So I'm really curious to kind of. That's wonderful. Thank you. That's really helpful.
And that's online. If they don't have that particular year online, it'll certainly be here at the LOC, I would imagine.
Right. Yeah, the undated list there does correspond with the press release by the NBC that says they had 62 stations and 7 delayed, whereas the pink list that's over there has more stations listed than the ultimate 62. Thank you.
Thank you. I was wondering, does the Library of Congress own the whole thing, and how do we get to see it?
Well, you can see it in the Moving Image Research Center, and you can make an appointment. And they also own the other ones that Price was in. So the Magic Flute, Dialogues of the Carmelites, and Don Giovanni, including the very controversial Don Giovanni florist commercials that nobody liked. So that one elicited protest because people didn't like the fact that it was interrupted by commercials for flowers. But you can watch all of them, yeah, up there. Oh, it'd be wonderful. I will suggest that to Paul.
Just 2 questions. You mentioned at one point in history the number of Black employees at NBC. I wonder what influence or involvement at all they had in any of this. And then the second question, how did white performers react to the opportunity to perform with these integrated companies? Do we know anything about that?
Yeah. Those are really good questions. So to the first one, a lot of work's been done on Joseph E. Baker because he was brought in as this kind of press relations consultant. I believe in the press department as well, George Norford was an important Black employee in terms of like dealing with the press. And if you're interested in this, Murray Foreman has written a great chapter all about how the NBC dealt with the Black press, and they would have these roundtables and how the Black press got very frustrated with these constant roundtables. So those are 2 that come to mind because they're always consulted. Also, fascinatingly, I didn't mention this, but the Emperor Jones, when they were thinking about doing that, there is some evidence that they reached out to the NAACP, and the NAACP said, well, you shouldn't do this because it's going to, promote racist stereotypes. But the NBC Opera also went to an HBCU to see it being performed in the play version. So you had kind of different factions who were trying to figure out whether or not it could be done. And later it's done in the spoken play version, but not the opera. But the NAACP takes responsibility saying, this is great, because they didn't do this, Emperor Jones, now we get Tosca. Like, that's kind of what this has led to. Oh, I'm so sorry. Now I've forgotten your second question. I've gotten too into the first. I didn't see anything in the archives that was negative from white performers or positive. So I didn't see either or. A lot of the performers were very young, not surprisingly, and also NBC Opera worked very closely with New York City Opera, so you see a lot of back and forth between those performers. And so City Opera had some integrated casting earlier, so perhaps it was not quite as surprising for those performers.
Thanks again for the great engaging lecture. I guess as what you hinted, I think earlier in your lecture, I guess I was curious if you did more research or had thoughts, on this kind of fine line between, I guess, racial or social progress versus capitalism. People of color are going to like to see people of color on television. They're going to buy more products and merchandise, maybe like with rap music, as soon as it makes money, other people get involved. And also if, this performance with Price, led to, like you said, with Star Trek and other very pioneering shows down the road on NBC, especially like Different World and Cosby Show down the road.
No, I think that's a really good point. And I think it's interesting because you see that technique of what can we sell from both sides, right? So the CCMP is very aware that if they tap into this is an audience and they buy products, and in the quote that I showed you, they're actually trying to almost suggest that sponsors should take this on as well. Because of course sponsors are the ones who pay for television programming. NBC Opera is really fascinating because they don't usually have sponsors. The only ones that have sponsors are Amal and that one time with Don Giovanni. So Amal is sponsored by Hallmark, and Don Giovanni in '61 is sponsored by the Florists. So it's interesting because the NBC is paying for it. So in some ways, they can not worry about what a sponsor may or may not think, but they're also doing it for financial reasons because they want the good press so that, they can kind of get more viewers for their other shows. And what's fascinating is only, I think, a month after this broadcast, there was a boycott of all the networks that's organized because they hadn't really had much in the way of like full integration of Black performers either. So
I think we have time for one or two more questions.
What made NBC so forward-thinking?
I think that General Sarnoff had been part of the Presidential Commission on Civil Rights, so that was part of it, and he's coming from a military background, and a lot of those anti-discrimination orders started in World War II, so that's part of it. But I also think that, as we see in the documents, they were very concerned with how they were going to appear to a potential audience, right, an audience of consumers. And so they are, in some ways, putting forward a very forward-looking policy, but then they're still kind of dealing with local affiliates. They're still kind of beholden to sponsors. So the progress is not always what the policy kind of promised.
So my question is related to Black representation, like in media, because I think that that's something that Black people have fought for a long time. Is like, I want to see someone who looks like me on screen, and so we're getting this as early as the 50s. What was the reaction like on an individual level? Because we heard from your research from the NAACP, but what was the reaction like on an individual level from African Americans who are seeing this on film?
That is a fascinating question. The closest I think we can get to the individual level is the reaction in kind of the Black press to this performance, which sees it as kind of a positive step forward, but also notes that NBC has not done enough. The NBC, unfortunately, it's not doing kind of audience research reports after each one of these broadcasts. In fact, when it got all the phone calls and the letters, one of the press managers said, we need to keep this perpetually on file so that we can study it, but they didn't go through and keep every letter or necessarily keep every phone call. So we actually have more kind of aggregate, I suppose, understandings of what people were saying. And also, perhaps in keeping with their policy, they don't necessarily identify the race or sex of the person who is writing or in. So, I mean, the one person we can definitely identify is Virginia Rapp, but everybody else stays somewhat nameless in that respect. Thanks.
Thank you again so much, Danielle. We're running.